My name is Jacob, and my childhood was painted rusty and soaked in the smell of cheap bourbon and despair. We lived in an old creaky trailer on the outskirts of Detroit, somewhere between an abandoned steel mill and endless fields overgrown with weeds. Fear was a constant background, like the rumble of a distant highway, and its name was Father. Robert Bobby Donnelly. He was not born a monster. Grandma, when she visited us, rarely, she was afraid of Bobby, showed photos of a smiling guy in a cap hugging his first, shiny '68 Mustang. Then there was Vietnam. He never talked about it. Not a word. Only the medals in a dusty box on the top shelf of the closet, and the night screams that made him jump up in a cold sweat and then sit on the porch until morning, smoking cigarette after cigarette, staring into the darkness as if he saw something horrible there. And a bottle. The bottle became his anchor and his storm at the same time. My first clear memory is 5 years old. Father broke in late, slamming the door so that the trailer shuddered. Mom muttered something quietly. There was the clink of a broken glass and her stifled cry. I stuck to the crack in the thin partition of my room. He held her hand, pressing her to the refrigerator covered with children's drawings. His face, distorted by an unfamiliar rage, was illuminated by the dim light of a kitchen lamp. "Shut up! It's all because of you! Damn life!" His voice was hoarse, like the screech of the brakes of a train. I didn't cry. I froze, merged with the shadows. I learned this early. Reality is when, at the age of 7, you go to a convenience store for bread and peanut butter and hide the change in the hollow of an old elm tree behind a trailer, just in case. Because if my father found even a quarter, it would turn into a bottle of the cheapest whiskey. Reality is when Mom always hides a yellowish tint of bruise under the blush on her cheekbone. And you pretend not to notice, because otherwise it will be worse for everyone. But there were also islands, rare, like clear stars over a smoky city. When my father surfaced, for a day, sometimes for 2, he became quiet, guilty. He clumsily tried to fix things. He repaired a leaking faucet in a tiny bathroom, which then leaked again, tinkered with a used lawnmower. It will work. Once, after a particularly long lull, he dragged home an old, silver-painted Schwinn bicycle. I remember how we rode on a dusty dirt road around the trailer park on one of these Sundays. It was the end of summer. The air was shivering from the heat, but it was clean for our places. He ran beside me, pushing me, and laughed hoarsely with anguish, but for real. "Pedal, Jake." The wind whistled in my ears, and for a moment I forgot about the creaking of the trailer, about the fear, about the smell of fumes eating into the walls. This day, this piece of freedom, I carved and hid deep in my soul. Like others. The day he, drunk and staggering, finally dragged himself to my baseball game in Little League. He sat in the stands, shouted something incomprehensible, then loudly woke up the neighbors with a snore. I wanted to sink through the ground. But then, at home, lying on the sofa, he muttered, "Good. Blow. Sun." And this strangely also became an island, because he came, through the bottle. The day my mom broke her arm after slipping on the wet floor at the diner where she worked. My father was sober for almost a week. Unbelievable. He rushed about like a wounded animal. He tried to cook inedible canned sausages, scolded the stupid doctors. He brought her a cheap bouquet of gas stations to the hospital. He stood in the corridor, crumpling his cap in his hands, not daring to enter the ward. There was a child's confusion in his eyes. On the evening when she was discharged, he did not drink. We sat at a cramped table, ate his masterpiece. It was quiet, awkwardly, but without shouting. This also entered my secret archive. But the islands were immersed in shadow. Faster. The drinking became longer, angrier. There were friends, unshaven men in leather vests, who came on noisy motorcycles. They entered, the door to the kitchen slammed shut. Then my father would come out, gray, sweaty, with shaking hands, and disappear. He returned with empty eyes and a new bottle of cheap whiskey. Mom was melting. From a woman who was still smiling at her Mustang in old photos, she turned into a shadow, forever tired, with dull eyes the color of faded denim. She worked 2 jobs, during the day as a waitress in a diner, at night as a cleaner in the office. All the money went to my father's debts, to food, to my school uniform. Her love was quiet, haggard, a quick kiss on the top of my head before leaving for the night shift, an extra portion of potatoes on my plate, ironed with a t-shirt. She hardly spoke of her father. Only sometimes, when it was especially raging, such a deep, bottomless pain flashed in her eyes that my throat tightened. My rebellion came at 17. I grew up. He became taller than him, wider in the shoulders. Once, as always, he yelled at his mother for, "The coffee is cold." She was silent, her head bowed. And something exploded in me. I stood between them. "Enough!" My voice trembled, but it sounded loud. He was taken aback. For a second. Then his eyes filled with cloudy, drunken anger. "What the hero is looking for?" He pushed me in the chest. I didn't back down. He pushed back. We clashed. It was not a fight, but a pathetic, drunken fuss. He was stronger, but he staggered. We collapsed on the floor, hitting a flimsy table. Mom shouted, "Stop it! Please!" I felt the taste of blood on my lip, his heavy alcoholic breath. Suddenly he coughed. Terrible, angry, as if his lungs were tearing apart. I broke free. He was sitting on the linoleum, leaning on his arm, coughing so that he was shaking all over. There was no malice in his eyes. There was emptiness and shame. Mom rushed to him. I stood, shaking with adrenaline and hatred, wiping my blood. This day did not become an island. He became an abyss. After school, I left, in Chicago. He studied at a community college, worked in a car service, built his own life. He called only his mother. She told about herself. Briefly, "I work." "That's all right, I'm getting tired." About his father. Monosyllabic. "He drinks." "Coughs." "Bad." I sent money. Mom. Secretly. Knowing that some of it will go to his friends or whiskey, but he could not do otherwise. The father became a ghost until my mother calls. Her voice was different, thin, cracked. "Jake? Daddy? In the hospital. Not good. Very much. Doctors say lung cancer, 4th stage, because of everything." I arrived. To the same trailer park, only even more dilapidated, smelling of mold, medicines, and hopelessness. My father was lying on the sofa, small, withered as a splinter. The big man who had once inspired fear was now barely breathing. Each breath came with whistling and wheezing. The eyes were huge in the sunken face and looked through me. Mom walked around him like a ghost. She straightened the blanket, gave him water, pills. She looked exhausted to the limit, but there was a strange, doomed tenderness in her movements. It was as if all the pain had been erased before this total collapse. I sat down next to him, lump in the throat. "Hey, Dad." He slowly turned his gaze to me. "Learned? I don't know." His lips moved. "Jake, ... Then his gaze fell on my hands, which were rough from working with the engines. He tried to raise his hand, bony and blue-veined. With difficulty I reached it. He touched my palm. His fingers were as cold and weightless as paper. He was trying to say something, only wheezing. And suddenly, a tear. One. Slowly she rolled down her sunken cheek and got lost in the gray stubble. He closed his eyes. I sat holding his hand in mine. First, and he did not feel hatred, but terrifying pity and bitterness. For him, for my mother, for yourself, for all the years of fear, poverty, and the unspoken. for the love that may have been somewhere out there, under the layers of pain, whiskey, and Vietnamese nightmares, but never broke through. It went out. He died long and hard, almost a month. I stayed. He helped his mother. I cleaned it up, bought medicines, sat with it at night, listening to this terrible gurgling wheeze. Sometimes he came to his senses for a while. He stared into the void. Once he suddenly said clearly, "Sarah, I'm sorry." His mother, who was sitting next to him, shuddered, squeezed his hand, sobbed silently, burying her face in the blanket. He didn't speak anymore. Just before the end, he opened his eyes. He looked right at me. His gaze was unexpectedly clear, deep. He tried to smile. Only the corner of his lip twitched, and in a whisper, barely audible, "Bicycle. Remember? Fly ... Then his gaze darkened, went inside. A few hours later, he was gone. We buried him in an old cemetery on the outskirts of the city. Mother stood by the grave, straight and dry. There were no tears. It seemed that she had cried them all for 30 years. I put my arm around her shoulders. She was as light as a feather. "That's it, Jacoby. It's over," she whispered. Returning to the empty trailer, we silently sorted through his meager belongings. My mother gave me one thing, an old Zippo with an engraving. It was embossed with the silhouette of the helicopter and the dates of its service in Vietnam. He took care of it. I almost didn't use it, but he always carried it with him. The lighter was heavy, steel, with a faded engraving. I clicked, and the flames flared up evenly. He kept the fuel in it, to the end. I picked up my mother in Chicago. She lives in a small apartment, quiet as always. Sometimes he looks out the window at the lights of the city. He rarely talks about the past. I work as a mechanic. I have my own life. I think I've got out. But sometimes, when a heavy gray sky hangs over the city, like in Michigan, or when I hear a sharp shout or feel an outburst of anger within me, I freeze. I recognize his shadow in me. I pull out that old Zippo. I feel the coldness of the metal, the roughness of the engraving. He's like Bobby, tarnished, with a history of pain. But he survived the war, and my war with him. The flame flares up, bright, alive, driving away the shadow for a moment. I won't throw it away. He's part of my America. Real, unadorned, with a rusty belt and dusty stars of hope, which sometimes still peeked through the soot, with the smell of bourbon and, for a moment, freedom on an old bicycle, with my mother's tired smile, and with his hand, cold and light, in my palm that last time. This is also true. The hardest truth is that pain and something vaguely resembling love can live in the same heart, forever intertwined, like an engraving on a steel Zippo.